Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's program of the Commonwealth Club. I'm Scott Schaefer, Senior Editor of Politics and Government at KQED, and I'm pleased to be the moderator for tonight's conversation. And joining us is Xavier Becerra. He's the Attorney General of California. Mr. Becerra is deeply connected with California, a Sacramento native who has spent decades in public service. During his 12 terms in Congress, Becerra chaired the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and the House Democratic Caucus. Following Kamala Harris's election to the U.S. Senate in 2016, Governor Jerry Brown appointed him to fill the rest of her term as California's Attorney General. He is, as you may know, the first Latino to hold the office of Attorney General, and we're pleased to welcome him here tonight to discuss his work, including his many lawsuits against the Trump administration. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Xavier Becerra.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
So have you sued him today?
My parents couldn't have done better, right?
Have you sued the president today? No.
I better check. No.
I just want to begin by, obviously this is a sophisticated audience, but you've been in the news a lot in the last 18 months largely because of these lawsuits that have been filed against the Trump administration. But the Attorney General's office is a huge office with a lot of power. Give us a sense of the range of things that the AG is responsible for.
Oh gosh, our first responsibility is public safety. Some people don't know this, but we have one of the largest law enforcement agencies in the country. Think of it as the state's version of the FBI, the DEA, all rolled up into one. And so day in, day out, we're working with local law enforcement, actually federal law enforcement, including ICE, making sure we're going after folks who are trying to do us harm, whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's human trafficking, whether it's drug trafficking, or whether it's the crime that's going on in some of our smaller communities, smaller counties that can't afford to have their own forensics labs, that can't afford to have their own investigators. We're the ones that step up to the plate to do that work. And so day to day, the most important thing I do, the most active thing I do is providing for public safety. On top of that, the consumer work we do, I think, is pretty well known. We probably have the most aggressive consumer rights division in the country. Well, I can say it clearly now with the DOJ and at the U.S. level not doing its job, that California probably has the premier consumer protection agency in California to enforce consumers' rights. And so when we've gone after, we just recently filed a suit against Sutter Health, which is well known here in Northern California. It's the largest hospital system in the Northern California area. We pay more for healthcare in Northern California by a factor of sometimes 50% than do folks in Southern California. And that's because of the concentration of these provider networks. And it makes it very difficult for even the insurance companies to compete. So we do so much day to day that goes beyond the actions we've had to take against the Trump administration.
And you filed almost 40 lawsuits, I think, on a wide range of things: environmental issues, DACA, women's health, travel ban, transgender people in the military, on and on, student loan issues. You ever wonder how your life would be different right now if Hillary Clinton had won?
I don't have time to think about that. We keep busy. It's the circumstance you're in, and you can't live in the past, and you just move forward. And I thank the Lord and the second guy right behind him, Jerry Brown, for giving me this chance to serve as AG.
Well, let me ask you about that, because the governor is known to be a very deliberative guy. We were chatting earlier that we're still waiting. It's been a year for him, for him to appoint a Supreme Court justice. We think he's got a reason for waiting, but nonetheless, he's very thoughtful about these things. What kind of questions did he ask you when you first talked to him about this job?
He was very probative. This all happened in a matter of about 2 days, because I had not been seeking the position, and I had not been on any lists. It sort of gelled very quickly, and over the course of about 2 days, by phone, I was in D.C., he was here in California. We had some conversations. He asked me a lot about public safety, a lot about the environment, a lot about what my values were, what I thought, what I believed I would be doing. I mentioned that I expected to be using my experience at the federal level quite a bit. And it was just a good conversation. I got to tell you, we're very fortunate to have Jerry Brown as our governor. Yeah, he is a man who is very experienced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And did you, when he announced that you were going to be the new Attorney General or the nominee, it was, of course, noted that you were the first Latino. To what extent do you think he was thinking of the symbolism and the importance of it, given how immigration and the attitude of the Trump administration to especially Latinos and people coming across the border?
I don't think there's much that Jerry Brown does that doesn't have forethought, that hasn't some point on the horizon in mind. And so I have no doubt that he gave consideration to a lot of those things, hoping to leave for California a sense of what we would look like and do in the future. And again, I was very fortunate to be the beneficiary.
I think a lot of people didn't know really what kind of president Donald Trump would be. And I think there were some, like John Cox, who's now running for governor as a Republican, said he didn't vote for Trump because he didn't think he was conservative enough. What has surprised you as Attorney General in terms of the things he has done? Because he's broken all the rules, and he did that during the campaign, things that he said about John McCain and many other people. I mean, what has really surprised you?
About Donald Trump?
Yeah.
Quite honestly, not that much. I mean, I'm surprised at the depth at which he's sunk, and to the degree that he is jeopardizing what I believe makes America great, and really the beacon for the world in many ways, and that's our institutions, that he's corroding the strength and the pillars of our institutions, including the Supreme Court, to the point where his mark will go far beyond his tenure in the White House. But I'm not surprised given what he said, what he's doing. I don't believe he had a particular agenda in mind. My sense is he was doing what he thought would make him look good. He wants to keep everybody off their footing, and he wants to claim everything as a victory. And so wherever he spots an opportunity to say, I won, like he did with NATO recently. What a disaster, but he claimed he made it better. And that's Donald Trump. So I'm not surprised. I tell folks, I don't listen to what he says, I watch what he does.
Yeah. You, as I said, have filed nearly 40 lawsuits. Of all the issues you've taken, I'm sure you're going to say, oh, well, they're all important, but are there ones where you just feel really in your gut, really personally strongly about because of whatever, for whatever reason?
I mean, most are really important. You have to. I'm not a litigious guy. Well, now I am. But you have to really be able to tolerate being in court because it's expensive. It takes time. You expose a lot of who you are. In this case, as a state for the Attorney General. So it's not a fun thing to have to go into court and sue. And so we don't do it lightly. There are other cases we could have taken to court against the Trump administration that we've tried other ways to do it. But when you go to court, it's because it's the last resort to try to defend your values. And every one of the lawsuits, we're close to 40, are about our values. And I don't know if you've read today's news about how we have exceeded our goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in California. We are today... that's great stuff. We're today below our 1990 levels of emissions on greenhouse gases. That's tremendous. Now, it's a good thing. We could cheer ourselves, pat ourselves on the back because we did something good. But we did something important that was expensive. It cost us a lot of money over these last decades to be able to do that. A lot of our industry and our businesses had to do a whole bunch of stuff that costs money. Can you imagine now if we have a president, an administration that says, let's go back to the polluting ways. It's okay. You can manufacture polluting ways. You can put products out there that were created by doing a lot of pollution. For our industries that have gone cleaner or clean, it would be very expensive to start to try to compete by going to the race to the bottom. And so you got to defend a state, a people, an industry that's gone out there and done the right thing the right way. And so when we sue the EPA, and we haven't had a loss yet against Scott Pruitt and the EPA, when we went in to defend the Affordable Care Act. We're the lead plaintiff in a case to defend the Affordable Care Act in court against Republican states that are trying to eliminate it altogether. We are the lead in the DACA litigation to protect the DACA Dreamers and got the nationwide injunction. And so I guess, Scott, what I'm trying to say is that every one of them was important because every one of them is a reflection of California's values and how we have been innovators, we're pioneers, and why should we stop doing the things that have let us become the economic engine for this country, have allowed us to graduate more people from college than any other state, have allowed us to move over Great Britain, the 5th largest economy in the world. Why should we stop doing that? And so I sue because I see no one coming up with a better answer to do things better. So we're just going to keep doing what California has done to make us a great place.
How do you, sanctuary state, you had a victory this week in court. The judge in Sacramento, federal judge John Mendez, throughout most of the dismissed most of the lawsuit against California, except for some little bits of one of the bills that the law that was really aimed at employers and whether or not they could allow ICE agents into the business to talk to workers. But that issue, I mean, there are a lot of issues like the wall, DACA, where public opinion allowing undocumented citizens to become undocumented immigrants become citizens, there's pretty broad consensus in California. But the sanctuary state and the sanctuary city policies is more divided. And we saw that, as this issue was percolating, and we saw in Orange County, some of the county government, some of the cities, same with San Diego, and law enforcement talked about being uncomfortable or felt like they were between a rock and a hard place in terms of how they could cooperate or not with ICE. Are you sympathetic with the sheriffs and the police departments and the confusion? I know you issued guidelines to them, but as the state's top cop, do you empathize with what they're going through?
Well, I've met with all the sheriffs and the chiefs of police in most of the major cities. Talked to them quite a bit. Early on, I met with the sheriffs even before SB 54, which is the law that was challenged by the Trump administration, had become law. And I've sat with them because we're trying to make sure that they understand what the law might say and how we can work with them. And so I get their concerns. We've tried to help them understand how the law operates. And I think it was a great victory because I think most people don't have a clear understanding of what is meant by a sanctuary jurisdiction. You will not find sanctuary jurisdiction, sanctuary city defined anywhere. Essentially what it means is that we wish to be able to have a strong working relationship with by our law enforcement officials with our communities that we must keep safe. If someone witnesses a crime or is the victim of a crime, we want them to come forward in order for us to go after the perpetrators of the crime. But if you've got a part of your community that's unwilling to talk to you because you're wearing a uniform and they think you may be an ICE agent instead, then you're not going to catch those criminals. And those victims will never be compensated or made whole. And so we've made decisions in California that we want to work with all our communities, including our immigrant families, to make sure that we can do public safety. And the reason it's called sanctuary is because we're trying to say to all those mothers that are shopping at a grocery store or fathers who are at work or kids who are at school, we're not a place that's going to treat you like a criminal. You can do those things, and we're not going to disturb you if you disturb public safety. If you go after, do the wrong stuff, then we're going to go after you. But we're not out to be the deporters in chief. And so we are fighting to protect our ability under the U.S. Constitution, the 10th Amendment, to do public safety the way California wishes. Trump administration has tried to threaten a lot of money, millions of dollars, saying if you don't do it our way or for us, immigration enforcement and deportation, then we're not going to send you monies that you have otherwise earned. We're saying you can't do that. You can't commandeer us that way. It's against the Constitution. And the victory we received was with the court saying, that's right. The federal government does not have that power.
Just across the street, few years ago now, there was a tragedy. Kate Steinle was walking with her dad, and undocumented citizen picked up a gun. He says it accidentally went off. The bullet ricocheted, killed her. And of course, the Trump administration, President Trump, or Donald Trump, when he was running for president, made a big issue of that. And I'm wondering if you, or the Democrats, people who support the sanctuary policy and idea of not cooperating with ICE, is there a concern that those kinds of things can happen and they can be made into a big political issue that could, come back to haunt Democrats?
Yeah, first I think you have to say to the Steinle family, to any family that is the victim of any crime, whether it's committed by an immigrant or anyone else, that you wish to be able to say that that's not going to happen to anyone. And we should have laws that make sure that that doesn't happen to anyone. And the laws that we have with regard to how we conduct our public safety, especially with regard to our immigrant communities, do not prevent our local law enforcement from preventing crime from occurring like that. We can still go after folks who are trying to do us real harm. We can still go after felons. We can still go after those who are committing serious crime. What we're saying is we don't want to use our public safety personnel and resources to help ICE go after the mother, as I said, who's at the grocery store doing nothing but shopping for food for dinner. They have a right to do that. As much as some people may object, ICE has a right to go after, if they've got credible evidence, someone who they think is in the country without documents. But we don't have to join them in that effort against that mom at the grocery store. But someone who's trying to do us harm, absolutely. They're criminals first. Whether they're immigrant criminals or U.S. citizen criminals, they're criminals or they're trying to do us harm, and we have a right with our public safety laws and our law enforcement agencies to go after folks who are trying to do us harm.
I want to ask you about sort of the arc of your life a little bit. As I mentioned, you're the first Latino Attorney General. Your mom, I think, was born in Jalisco, Mexico. Your dad went back and forth across the border for work or whatever, family. I think you were the first in your family to graduate from college, right? University.
Yes.
And you went to Stanford.
I did.
And so I'm just wondering, a lot of kids in immigrant families their parents don't really think about sending their kids, because they didn't go to college, and then maybe they think it's not possible or it's not for them or whatever. How did you end up at Stanford?
I grew up born and raised in Sacramento. I applied to Stanford. I didn't know where Stanford was until the day my mom and I were driving to start my first day at the university. It was a bit of a fluke. I applied to one university, and that was UC Davis. I had attended, I think, right around in between my sophomore and junior years, a summer program for gifted students who showed some promise. And they said, just keep up your grades. And there's a good chance, if once you apply, that you can get into UC Davis. So keep up your grades. So I thought, okay, I'll keep up my grades. I applied. I got in, and right before that I'd gotten in, a friend of mine was about to throw something into a wastebasket in class, and I think he had not done well on an exam, or if I recall. And I said, what are you doing? He said, I was going to apply to this school, but I'm not going to do it anymore. And I said, well, don't throw it away. Give it to me. And it was application to Stanford. And so I filled it out. And in those days, we didn't have computers. We didn't even have IBM Selectric typewriters. So I would white out my mistakes. And my best letter of recommendation came from my school counselor. My dad went to the 6th grade. My mom didn't come to this country till she was 18 when she married my father. They had no idea where Stanford was. I was lucky, and I thank the Lord for all those taxpayers who back in the 70s allowed my parents. My dad never made more than about $23,000 any year as a construction worker, who made it possible for me to get financial aid, student loans, work study, so that I could afford to go, because there's no way my parents could have ever afforded Stanford.
And what was it like to go from, living in the working class family? I don't know where you lived in Sacramento, but suddenly you're in Palo Alto with, kids, a lot of privileged kids. Well, how did you feel?
I was first grade. The home we had was about 685 square feet, if I recall. My dad, construction worker, added on a little bit here, expanded a bit once we got to 4 kids. We never lacked food, and my mom's a great cook, so we always ate well. I thought I was middle class until I drove through Palo Alto, and then and I knew, wow, there's a lot more to this life. And so, I had a great life. I was a latchkey kid. I didn't know what a latchkey kid was until folks started saying latchkey kids. And that was my 3 sisters and me, because my mom was working, my dad was working. We'd come home, but it was still pretty safe. I could get on my bike and go just about anywhere. And I look back at those years, and I always say to folks, I'm doing my job if I'm making sure that a construction worker married to a clerical worker today can send their kids to college, buy a home, and then retire in dignity. That's what my parents did. And I wish I could say that that's the case, but it's tough, especially in Northern California, to believe you can afford to buy a home as a construction worker and a clerical worker and send your kids to a Stanford University or somewhere else. But if we could get to that point, then by God, take a look. I've got 3 daughters now. Stanford, Yale. We pay full freight. And I'm proud of that, because I think I'm paying back to my country because they made an investment in me. And I think it's great to be able to say that. By the way, I should also add, my wife's a physician, so she's really the one that pays full freight.
You graduated from Stanford, then you stuck around, you went to Stanford Law, and I think, if I remember correctly, your wife was maybe in medical school or working in Massachusetts, and you went back there and you were there. And I think one of the first jobs you had out of law school, you were doing advocacy for people with mental illness.
Yes.
Is that right? What did you learn from that experience that you applied, either in politics or now in the law?
I worked for legal services, helping folks who were mentally ill, who were low income. The thing that stuck with me most was that, because I'd always learned that as someone who was of minority status, that sometimes it was a little tougher. Folks didn't quite understand you that well. But I learned that there were a lot of folks who weren't minority, but who had a mental condition, who also were not understood well and not treated well. And so it was a great experience. I also got to, for the first time, live on the East Coast. And my wife was studying medical school at Harvard, and it was a great experience to see the differences in the 2 coasts. I learned a lot. I was making $18,000 when, in those days, you coming out of Stanford Law School, you could make $70,000 or $80,000. So it was a great experience. I loved every moment of it, and I think it's one of the things that's helped me in my values today.
Yeah, you ended up in Congress. You were in the legislature for a short time,
1-2-year term,
just a few years, and then you ran for congressional seat in L.A. and you won.
Yes.
Was Congress what you expected?
In many respects, yes, but then I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what Stanford was going to be like, because I didn't even know where it was.
You knew where the Capitol was, though, right?
But I had visited it actually when I was in legal aid, because the program I was in had all of us I was a fellow in a program that no longer exists because the federal government has cut the funding for legal services over the years. But we went to D.C. to meet as a group, and so that was my first experience going to Washington, D.C., visited the Capitol, took some photos. Never thought I'd go there or work there. But in my eyes, it was more than I expected, because, again, I didn't know what to expect. And I got in to Congress in 1992, so I got elected when Bill Clinton became president. And I got to experience my first 2 years in the majority in the House with a Democratic Senate and a Democratic president. So it was kind of fun, even though I was a freshman member. Then we hit the dark days after 1994. But you learn so very much. And I always tell folks it is painful to be in the minority. But when you're a minority in the minority, it's a double whammy.
A lot of members of Congress, especially House members, because they have to run every couple of years, just are so burdened, it seems, by fundraising. It's a never-ending.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard story like the percentage of time they have to spend. I mean, what was that like? And especially after Citizens United, I mean, you really had to keep up. I think, right?
Yeah, it hasn't stopped. I have to do that now as someone running for office for the AG position. It's corrosive. We better, I hope at some point we get a grip on this. How the Supreme Court could equate money to speech is beyond me. It's, I believe, one of the worst decisions. I don't remember what the numbers were. I think it was a 5-4 decision.
Anthony Kennedy wrote this.
Yeah. I think to equate money with speech is to me, it's painful.
Yeah.
Because that means there are a whole bunch of Americans who don't really have speech. And so it's unfortunate, but if we could get rid of as much money as possible, or at least make it transparent, that would help us so much.
Yeah. It's almost like, I don't want to say bribery, but I mean, it's pay to play in a lot of ways, right? I mean, the access that, and of course it all depends on the elected official. And, a lot of Willie Brown had a saying, which I can't repeat, but basically.
There aren't too many things you can repeat from
basically said, look, if you can't take their money and then not vote with them, that's this totally sanitized version of that.
Yeah.
And so I guess you have to be able to do that.
Yeah, you do. And, but again, the two problems are that you're constantly chasing money, and then two, you're constantly trying to avoid the impact of what money can have or what it would like to have. And so it's just not, it's corrosive. It's just corrosive.
Yeah. And people say they want public financing, but then they don't, because they don't want to pay for it, right?
Right. That's the one thing about I believe American society that I wish I could change a little bit more and others could change, and that's that we're such a throwaway society. We're so accustomed to being able to unpack the plastic wrapper and then just instantaneously put it into the microwave and have it ready for us, and then throw away the plastic and we're done. And that includes with our issues as well. And so on campaigns and elections, well, we want to just be able to vote and get it done with and not worry about it. And people don't want to think about the money that's in campaigns. And if people only realize that we spend way more money, or there's way more money in our electoral politics as a result of not having constraints than there would be if you had public financing, perhaps they think differently. But they don't go those next steps. It's just, no, I don't want to have to pay for some guy I don't agree with to be able to run for office.
Yeah. I want to weave in some of the audience questions here. And this question is, how long will it take the institutions of government to recover from Trump's assaults?
Mm-hmm. So that's where the courts, we've relied on the courts. As I said, we've had far more victories than I ever expected. But at some point we're going to get to the Supreme Court, and who knows? And it is tough. It took a long time to build these institutions. It's going to take Donald Trump some time to try to undermine them. But if you can plant a time bomb into them, it could be very consequential. And so I just hope that the men and women who are in these institutions stand strong, and whether it's the three branches of government, but perhaps more importantly today, the press. If we can keep the press strong, I think that will undergird what makes our democracy so great.
You mentioned the Supreme Court, and of course, with Kennedy's retirement now, the president has nominated Brett Kavanaugh. What concerns you? I don't know if you know him at all, but what's your concern about the direction of the court?
Well, first, I think the direction that we're seeing in that we're no longer looking for the best, the most prepared and the most capable to serve as one of the 9 justices for 320 million people. That's got to be a concern to all folks, because now it's become a political selection process. And I fear that of the 3 branches of government, most people considered, or maybe still considered, the judiciary to be the one nonpartisan player in that trio. But the moment you make that referee a partisan, you've really lost something. And I believe we're going to start to lose more and more respect for the court and for their decisions, which I think is bad, because you have to have a final arbiter. Someone's got to be the final person. It's like when your parents, your kids, you get in fights, and somebody has to decide. And if we no longer trust the decider, the court, the Supreme Court, then that's when I think you see the breakdown of the democracy, and you start to see anarchy, because then you start taking matters into your own hand.
There have been so many decisions, especially this last term, where it's so predictable how the justices are going to come down, and it's exactly all the ones appointed by Republicans vote one way, and Democrats, and of course that leads to a lot of 5-4 decisions. Do you think that the justices see it that way, or do they convince themselves that they're really focusing on the law and the merits? Because a lot of these, the Janus case, for example, the one that upended unions and their ability to collect dues from non-members, overturned precedent, and many people felt that was kind of a contortion of the situation and the law and the facts. Do you think that they, do they approach these things truly with an open mind, or do they really go into it knowing pretty much where they're going to end up?
First, I'm not a big believer in open minds. I know my mind is not open. I have values, and I bring those values to everything I do. I try to be open in how I look at things and will consider things, but I know I'm not open. When Donald Trump says dreamers are terrible, and he accuses a judge of not being able to render a decision because he's of Mexican origin, that hits. It's personal. But I'll try to make sure that I don't judge everything because I took personally his insults. So I don't think any justice goes into this with an open mind. I think they try to come out with a decision that can be considered fair based on the law and facts. And you can go any number of ways. Otherwise, it'd be hard to believe that we had Plessy versus Ferguson, or we had Jim Crow laws, or that we had Korematsu. All these decisions, I don't think anyone would say that the justices back then were less open than they are today. Let's be real. Nobody goes into something without a bias. It's just that you hope that they'll look at the facts and the law and try to render a decision that people with reasonable minds will say, okay, I can see how you got there. And that's why I think what's most important in a justice, at least at the Supreme Court level, is that experience and the sense of what drives America. So I don't expect every justice to be middle of the road, nonpartisan, et cetera. It's important that we be able to say, I think you tried to be a fair referee.
Yeah, but they do evolve, it seems. I do remember when Reagan appointed Sandra Day O'Connor, and then Kennedy, who was his third choice because Bork didn't get confirmed, and then there was Douglas Ginsburg, who was smoking pot in high school or something. So he was the third choice. But I remember people saying, "Oh, there goes Roe v. Wade," And obviously that didn't happen. And then Anthony Kennedy becomes a champion of gay rights, of all things. Do you think that we're now at a point where, in this case, Republicans, but Democrats too, they want to make sure they don't put people on the court who are going to evolve?
Unfortunately, I think that's sort of the thinking that goes on. And it's sort of driven each side thinking, well, I got to put somebody here in this position to replace so-and-so justice because I know if they get a chance, they'll try to replace that justice with someone else. It's unfortunate. It's a matter of who can pack the court the most and end up with a majority. And it just, as I said, the Supreme Court will lose. It's like when We saw how the Catholic Church lost so much respect because we saw in the open what so many knew in private, that many of these priests were doing things that were unthinkable with kids and others. But you lose this sense that there is a special place for these justices. And I think in a way that's very unfortunate, because you do need to have this extra level of respect for the Supreme Court, because, well, think Bush v. Gore. I still think they ruled wrong, but I respect the fact that they ruled. I've got to. Donald Trump has not earned my respect, but I respect the office of the president, and so I respect that we have a president. If you get to the point where you don't respect the Supreme Court, then you're going to say, hey, if you guys undo Roe v. Wade, or if you undo Citizens United, we're going to war, we're going to punches. I think it's just very difficult.
Yeah. You know, a lot of people, I mean, are angry still, a lot of Democrats that President Obama didn't get, Merrick Garland even a hearing, much less a vote. Do you think that Democrats fold too quickly? I mean, it seems like Republicans, it's a blood sport for them, and they play for keeps. I mean, do you think that Democrats are maybe too good government-like, or too, they want to do the quote-unquote right thing?
Yeah. Okay, so put what I just said about the courts and being fair and so forth, compartmentalize it over here. Okay, now you're asking me about party politics. I think one of the things that has made life difficult for the Democratic Party and many Democrats is that we've lost in the minds of people the sense that we really stand for something. And shame on us as Democrats if we can't get that back. And so this is where I want to go on this question about Merrick Garland. Had I been in the Senate, I would have said, Garland doesn't get a hearing, then the Senate doesn't do anything. We're going to do you want to disrupt the president's ability under the Constitution to nominate a Supreme Court justice, then we're going to disrupt your ability in the Senate to do what you're supposed to do. And I would have counterpunched every step of the way and said, you can't do that. You can't do that. And, well, that could have consequences, because now you're getting into a real fight. But sometimes you gotta fight. Winning doesn't come because it's just natural. It's around the corner. You got to fight to win. And I don't think I would descend to the point where I would fight unfairly, but I would use every tool at my disposal, as I do now as the AG, and as you can see from the 37 or 38 lawsuits we filed against Donald Trump. I'm going to use every tool at my disposal. I am not going to cave and let someone do this to me, because my values are at stake. And so there's where I think the party needs to just suck it up.
When it looked like Hillary Clinton was going to win, remember that? There were senators, I think maybe the senator from Oklahoma, I forget his name, but he was saying, well, I think maybe 8 justices is enough. I mean, it seemed like they were willing to just do whatever it took to prevent a Democratic president. I mean, it's kind of remarkable that look at, Mitch McConnell. I mean, that's probably one of his, crowning achievements as far as his donors are concerned, don't you think?
Senator McConnell understands the operations of the Congress, and especially the U.S. Senate. I don't say shame on Mitch McConnell. I say shame on those who allow Mitch McConnell to abuse. But I wouldn't do what Mitch McConnell has done were I in a position to be a Senate Majority Leader. But he hasn't committed a crime.
Yeah.
Again, I think he's undermining that precious balance. And if you don't like it, you can't just say it's not fair. You got to go out there and fight back.
Yeah. Here's an audience question. As a former member of Congress, why do you think Republicans in Congress aren't reaching across the aisle to oppose and delegitimize Donald Trump? You've seen a few people do it, but they're all, of course, not running next year. Jeff Flake and Bob Corker, for example.
I think they're going to milk Donald Trump for everything they can. And once
What does that mean?
Supreme Court justice, their tax cut bill, get rid of the Affordable Care Act, they'll do everything they want that they think is important on their agenda. And if they think they got everything they needed out of him, then I think you'll see them, they will let him fall as quickly as he can.
Yeah. We've got a question here about capital punishment, and I wanted to ask you about that as well. First of all, what is your position on capital punishment?
Personally, there are more than 140 cases where someone has sat on death row and subsequently been found innocent or proven not guilty. And so it's a flawed system. We're humans. And for us to pass judgment, you have to be fail-proof. So I knew the moment I decided to take this position that the first thing I had to do as AG was to swear that I would uphold the Constitution of the United States and of the state of California. Our California Constitution has a provision that calls for the death penalty. The people of California in 2016 passed an initiative that accelerates implementation of the death penalty. And so while I have personal reservations about that, the way it has, or about the concept of the death penalty, I know my job is to enforce. My team has had to defend the proposition in court.
Yeah. I think it's been 12 years since the last execution, 2006, January 2006. We know Governor Brown opposes capital punishment. He has for a very long time. It's hard for me to believe that he's going to preside over an execution, that he's going to slow walk, whatever it takes to slow that down. But at this point, I think there's some 17 people on death row that have pretty much exhausted their appeals. And so if executions start again, we could see quite a few executions. Do you think, how likely is that?
There are still legal infirmities in the process. That's always been the issue. Whether the courts find that those have been cured, we'll see. But the people of California have spoken several times on this, and there is a law. In fact, my legal team probably will be placed in the position to enforce the constitutional provisions. I had one case that dealt with the death penalty already. It was a case in Orange County, the largest mass killing in Orange County history. 8 people were killed at a beauty salon when the former spouse of one of the workers at the salon went in and point blank killed his wife and then went on to kill 7 other people, point blank. Interesting case because the guy confessed to the crime. So the issue wasn't whether he was guilty or not. It was just whether he should face the death penalty or serve life without parole. Orange County Sheriff's Department and the DA's office engaged in some shenanigans. The judge said, I'm taking the DA off the case, can't trust you. We came in to take over the case. The judge still came out with a ruling that said, I don't believe this man will get a fair hearing on the issue of death, so I'm going to sentence him to life. My team came to me and said, we think there are sufficient grounds for us to appeal. We need your sign off if we're going to appeal this to the California Supreme Court to seek the death penalty. And I said to my team, as I said to you, the process isn't perfect. And if you're asking me if we're going to take a life and can't undo that process if we find out it wasn't perfect, I'm not interested in making that kind of mistake. The judge just told us he doesn't believe that this process will allow him to have a fair hearing on whether he should die. And so I'm going to abide by the judge's decision that he will serve life, the rest of his life in jail, in prison.
We also have go ahead. There's been a lot made of one particular person on death row, Kevin Cooper, I think it is. Yeah. Nicholas Kristof from the Times has written about him. There are calls for a new trial, and there were a lot of evidence went ignored that he got implicated and then obviously convicted. What are your thoughts about that case? And I think that was in Southern California. I think was it Orange County also?
It was Southern California. I don't remember
Which county? It doesn't matter.
Yeah, and I have to be careful what I say because we handle all appeals, and this case may come back, and we might have to handle that case. What I can tell you is it's the Kristoff piece is jarring.
Can you maybe just say what a few of the facts? I mean,
So, Mr. Cooper, African American, is accused of having killed a family at their home, where most of the evidence there was not that much evidence of his presence there. There were some witness claims that there were other individuals, white males, who had been in the area and fit the characteristics of the people that some of these witnesses say they spotted in and around the vicinity of the home. The defendant, Mr. Cooper, was convicted based on the evidence. There's concern that the attorneys for Mr. Cooper have presented that some of that evidence might have been planted, and that the evidence that showed that there might have been white perpetrators of the murders, that was ignored, and that DNA evidence today could absolve him of the punishment.
yeah.
It's a very old case. I think it's about 30 years old, and it's gone through many iterations. My office, well before I came in, back in the 90s, I think, and in the early 2000s, was part of the efforts through the court system to examine a lot of this evidence, including DNA evidence. Now we've got better tools to examine DNA, and so the request now by the Cooper team is to take a look at the DNA now with the new, more sophisticated technology that we have on DNA. That is now before the governor to consider.
Yeah. I'm sure you've been to San Quentin Prison, which is an amazing place, and not what you might expect. It has a feel of, not death row, the other part of it, of almost a college campus. You know, there's a lot of lifers there walking around, going to class, and it's an interesting place. But there's also a lot of people there, and especially on death row, who say they didn't do it. So how do you factor all that in when you're talking about a guy like Kevin Cooper?
And I go back to what I said earlier about judges. You have to believe in our judiciary because someone's going to make that final call. And if you don't believe the referee on the field, then how can you ever feel comfort? I just recently finished making a phone call to the sister of a young man who died in the custody of police. We were asked by the family to examine the investigation conducted by the district attorney's office. The DA concluded that there was not enough evidence to prosecute the officers. We were asked to do a review. Our review is not on the entire evidence anew. It's to take a look at whether the DA's determination showed an abuse of discretion in the process of doing the investigation. I had to call this sister and say to her that our conclusion was that the DA's determination was not an abuse of discretion. That was a long conversation. Very little of it had to do with the duties that we had and the type of work that we did in the investigation we conducted. And I didn't expect it to be either. I knew what she would want to talk about. Those are always difficult. I would simply tell you that we have to be able to believe in our courts of justice because there are people who are sitting on death row, and if we don't believe that, or if we don't believe that the Supreme Court can make the right decision on a woman's own decision on what she'll do with her body, then I can tell you that those institutions that we rely on for this democracy are going to collapse.
Yeah. I've talked to Jerry Brown about his faith and the idea of redemption. I mean, he has released more, or not released, but allowed parole recommendations to go forward with, I'm sure now it's well over 1,000 lifers, something that past governors routinely reversed. It's really interesting. Part of that was the pressure to reduce the population, but I think part of it was his faith. And the belief in second chances for people. And I'm wondering, I'm going to guess that you were raised Catholic.
Yes.
Yes. How does your religion, influence the way you think about all these things?
Quite a bit, actually. My mom still prays the rosary every night. And while I, again, have some real issues with the institution, the Catholic Church, I'm proud to be a Catholic because I think the camaraderie you feel, the sense of belonging is very important. But again, I have my own mind. I have done everything I can to defend a woman's right to choose, which on occasion when I was in Congress would get me complaints from folks who say I should have been excommunicated from my church. It's interesting. My values impact so much of what I do. It's amazing how much my life experience is now reflected in what I'm doing. And I'm glad. And I wouldn't have it any other way. But I will tell you that I am stunned at the fact that someone as deliberative as Jerry Brown could do what he's done in using his pardoning powers and still be attacked. And at the same time, Donald Trump can use those powers in a way that just undermine those executive powers and why they're done. But he's done it. And what's interesting, and I go back to this thing about if you want to win, you got to fight. It's recognizing that Donald Trump has made it very clear you can get away with a lot of stuff in plain sight. And you don't have to be holier than thou in order to do something that you think is right. And I hope what we will learn is, whether we're watching Jerry Brown or Donald Trump, is that if you believe it's right, then do it. Whether you do it for the right reasons, as I think Jerry Brown does, or if you do it for totally wrong reasons, the way Donald Trump does it.
Yeah. We have a question here, and a big issue in San Francisco, and now it's really a statewide issue, homelessness. And there's a bill in the legislature, and I'm not sure if you can comment on something that may, I suppose, end up before you in one form or another, but one of the things that the new mayor, London Breed, is very supportive of is that legislation and the idea of expanding conservatorships, allowing counties, I think it's the probation departments perhaps, to have more control over getting people who who have serious mental health problems off the streets and into treatment. And there's obviously a lot of concerns about their civil liberties. But what are your thoughts about that?
First, a shout out to Mayor London Breed on her election. Secondly, I represented Los Angeles and downtown, so I had Skid Row in my congressional district. And so I did a lot of work with a lot of the organizations that were trying to help folks who were homeless.
And you were an advocate for people with mental illness.
Yes, and as an advocate for folks who are mentally ill, doubly important. The thing that I think people have now gelled around on the issue of the homeless, especially when it's chronic homelessness, is housing first. Because everything comes later. The treatment and all the rest. If you don't get someone stabilized in a place, they're always going to be in the state of flux. You need to give them an anchor and a place that is theirs that they can go to is an anchor, especially for someone who's mentally ill, who needs some assistance. You get them anchored, and to the degree possible, make it a one-stop shop for them so they can have a place, and nearby is the place they can get the services that they need. It works. And so I think it makes total sense to try to give folks who are having a mental condition that's leading to their homelessness housed as quickly as possible, because folks can function once they are given services and treatment, and that helps them. But again, giving them the anchor probably helps develop not just the esteem, the self-esteem, but also the sense of some direction in order for them to be able to move forward.
Would you be concerned about giving counties that option of conservatorship and, allowing them to, basically forcing them into treatment?
We're going to have to do something. I'm not sure if whether it's giving it to the counties or local governments or requiring it through the state. I'd be open to that kind of a question. I'm no longer a policymaker, but those are the kinds of things that you want to see how it can work best. You do it locally, and what you'll have is some counties or cities that do it well and others that don't. And you can't have that imbalance. And so you do, as a state, great, because now you have that sort of floor of what you must do, but then oftentimes it's less precise, it's less surgical, and so sometimes you miss the boat. Sometimes when you paint with a broad brush, you go beyond or don't do enough. And so I think it's a matter of figuring out how we can make sure that the services get to the people that need to have it, and we don't have some people who are doing their fair share and others that aren't. Everyone has to be on the bandwagon.
Yeah. A lot of political questions here. I know you're not a policymaker anymore, but they're interesting questions. So California has this top two primary system, which didn't result in some of the nightmares that Democrats were afraid it might lead to in terms of the congressional races, where you had two Republicans in the top two. But what are your thoughts about that system? The voters approved it, so it is the law of California, and voters would have to change it.
I'm not a fan. There are only two people who will be on the ballot at the very end when it counts. That means it's likely going to be a Democrat and a Republican, or in California, oftentimes a Democrat and a Democrat. You don't have peace and freedom. You don't have independent. You don't have, I don't care, left or right. You don't have all these different, Green Party. All these parties end up getting excluded on the ballot. And even though they're small parties, they're never going to be able to have their representation on the ballot. I think that's wrong. Two, I think this desire to avoid conflict. Can't we all get along? Let's, have top two vote getters. To me, it's a wimpy way of trying to do elections. I'd rather we go at it civilly, but give me your best punch and I'll give you mine back, and then let the people decide, rather than say we're afraid to have conflict. Maybe people say, you end up with Donald Trump if you don't have that. Well, you know what? We ended up with Donald Trump not because we had a system that allowed the parties to be out there. We ended up with Donald Trump because people didn't go vote. And I don't like when we try to cushion, when you try to stop people from seeing the full picture. Take the filter off the lens. Take a look at what it really is. And if you're not so concerned about things because we're getting these, extremists to get into politics, then do what you need to do, which is get more people to vote so we don't end up with extremists. Don't try to stop the extremists from getting there because you say, we'll get the top two and we won't let anyone from that extreme party be on the ballot.
What do you make of why so many people don't vote? And I'm thinking, if Democrats are going to pick up some of these House seats in California that Republicans now hold, districts where Hillary Clinton won, but the Republican got reelected, or in the case of Issa and Royce, they're retiring, but it's an open seat now. But in many cases, in this year too, in the primary, Latino voters really didn't turn out for Antonia Villaraigosa, for example. And I have my thoughts about that, but I'm wondering, after a year and a half, 2 years of Donald Trump, if that doesn't get people to the polls, what does it take?
So, quick experiment, and you don't have to show hands or anything, but think real quickly. If you've made donations in the last year, few years, or if you make donations, think quickly. What are the top three places that you make donations to? I'm going to be like that magician on the stage. I can probably guess that the places that you've given to are the places that are closest to you. Either your kids' sports associations, your church, your whatever you get involved in. If you're a big symphony buff, if you're a, it's what's closest to you. When was the last time you sent money to an organization that had very little to do with you? So to your question, why aren't folks voting? Because it's not close to them. You tell them, well, it makes a difference. We end up with a Donald Trump. They'll say to you, well, show me how Barack Obama or George Bush were any better for me. I'm still struggling. Life has not changed for me. My kids still go to tough schools. My job still pays me below what I need. No president has changed that for me. No legislator has changed that for me. Why? What I've said is that you need to establish a culture that makes voting sort of like when I was a kid, the expectation I'd get to drive as soon as I turned 16. That it was sort of the rites of passage that you have to go through in order to be able to do things that you want to do. And if we can get to the point of making it sound like voting is what lets you, have the things that you want, driving a vehicle, eating the dessert, whatever, there's got to be value to it. And I can guarantee you that for so many people, we just talked about homelessness. There are a whole bunch of Californians who don't desire to be homeless. How many politicians have helped them not be homeless? And what value will it be for them to vote if they have no expectation that the next set of politicians will keep them from becoming homeless? It's got to be close to you. And so, by the way, the next time you make a contribution, make it to an organization that isn't close to you.
We have a couple questions. We have just a few minutes left here. What are your plans for 2020? But generally, I mean, I don't expect you're going to say you're running for president, but you were on Hillary Clinton's vice presidential list, weren't you? Was that what was that about? I mean, did they talk to you about that? How serious was that? Did you have to send them the documents and all that stuff? How far did it go?
I don't think it went that far. I think Senator Kaine, I think, was clearly the front runner from the beginning. I think my name was in the mix, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be a very wide open field in 2020. And several Californians, including Kamala Harris and Mayor Garcetti in Los Angeles, maybe Gavin Newsom. He says he's not, but his name will be mentioned by the mentioners. What do you think it's going to take, for the Democrats to, what kind of candidate, should be nominated?
Someone who stands up and really can say, to me, Democrats, what makes Democrats special, why I'm a Democrat, is because I believe Democrats have stood for helping the working and aspiring class, the folks who want to be in the middle class, aspire to be in the middle class. And we show that we understand that if we can help you get to that step, sky's the limit. As again, I think, everything's personal to me. I'm perfect proof. From a guy who didn't go past the 6th grade, a guy who went to a place he didn't know where it was located, Stanford University, to now 3 daughters who are graduating from some of the best universities in the nation as well. That's the glass is half full. And if we can give people a sense that that's what the party does, is give you the sense that the glass is only half full. And if we can continue to be the party of innovation, which I think we've proven in California, we are the party that believes in letting people explore, that then we will capture people. But at the end of the day, you got to put your money where your mouth is, and you got to follow through. If we say we're going to fight for working class folks, you got to really fight for them. I can't believe Donald Trump is considered the guy who will champion fairness for workers in trade when he, all his merchandise comes from faraway places that he imports in. Yeah. But that's what it is. And I think if we can be clearly who we say we are, I think we have some glorious days ahead.
So we have just a minute left, and it says here, either read a very good audience question or one of your own. I feel a lot of pressure now. But why? I don't know if any of your daughters are planning to go into public service, but why, if someone came to you and said, hey, I'm thinking of a life in politics or public policy, but especially elective office, what would you tell them?
I applaud you. Thank you for making the sacrifice. Have you talked to your wife or your husband? Be sure you know what you're doing there.
Do you think the best and the brightest are going into politics?
Many, not always, but many. It's a noble calling. I love it. I wouldn't have it any other way. But be as I say, I always tell folks, to me, what impresses me most about the dreamers, the young kids who are undocumented, the DACA students and so forth, is that they get out there and they publicly say, I'm undocumented and unafraid. They are essentially telling people, I don't have status in this country, but I'm not afraid. Because I think if you hear my story, you'll say, you belong in America. I believe that if you're going to serve him in public service, if you're going to give your service to the public, then you got to be just like those DACA kids. You have to be unbowed and unafraid, because people have voted for you. They don't have a vote. They're putting their hopes in you, and if you disappoint, wow, you don't go out and vote. And so if you're going to run for office, by God, show your values. Don't be afraid. Don't filter. Let people see who you are. And then once you get in, if you're fortunate, get out there and be unbowed and unafraid.
All right, Javier Becerra, California Attorney General, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And this concludes our meeting of the Commonwealth Club.
Thank you.
Great. Oh, very nice.